Welcome to the Veteran Spouse Network podcast, brought to you in collaboration with Coming Home Well. I'm your host, Hannah O'Brien, both a veteran spouse and the program manager for the Veteran Spouse Network. On each episode of our show, I will host different guests to learn more about the stories, unmet needs, and resources available to our military and veteran families. We're the show that's making space for your stories, so that here you know you're never alone.
Hello, and welcome back to the Veteran Spouse Network podcast. I apologize for my raspy voice. I'm a little under the weather, but of course the podcast waits for no one. So here we are, but I am excited to be here to talk with our guest, Dr. Roxana Delgado, who is the wife and former caregiver of an Army veteran who sustained a TBI, amongst other injuries, while serving on his third tour in Iraq in 2009. Roxana co-founded the TBI Warrior Foundation with her husband and is a professor at UT Health San Antonio, where she researches on the military and veteran families, and specifically caregivers, which we'll get to hear some about today as well. And because of her focus, and because May is the month of the military caregiver, we're excited to have a discussion today on caregiving and the importance of protecting your identity when you're providing care to a loved one. So Roxana, I'd love to turn it over to you just to expand a bit more about yourself, your family, and your work.
Thank you so much, Veteran Spouse Network. It is an honor to be here. Thank you for this great opportunity to be able to speak with you and the caregiver community on this amazing month of the military caregiver. A little bit about myself. I was a military spouse for many years. My husband did 3 tours in Afghanistan and Iraq. And so like any other military spouse, I had to maneuver and really be very resilient in how we live those days. I enjoy it very much. I really love being an Army wife. My background is in epidemiology, and by no coincidence, I became a professor at UT San Antonio because the love that I have for this community has taken me and my career to really serve in different ways. So part of me, I am from Puerto Rico, originally from Puerto Rico. I've been living in Texas for almost 18 years and very much enjoy doing different activities and sharing with our community. And I have been very blessed and fortunate to have a very loving husband, a great community, amazing organizations that have been rallying around us to be where I'm at today. So I am very excited to be here, and I look forward to having this amazing and great conversation with you.
Us too. I'm so glad we got to book this time together. I think this is a really important conversation, not just about caregiving in general, which of course is important as well, but really focusing in on this, how it impacts your identity and how you can really care for yourself and protect your own identity when kind of things are pulling at that a bit. So I think something we hear a lot with our participants when we talk about caregiving is not everyone is exactly sure what that means. And we get what it means, but different organizations have different definitions. And even personally, some people may not want to identify as a caregiver. I may be a wife and say, well, that's what I signed up for, or a parent, that's what I signed up for. Or some people say, well, there are so many who have it way worse than me, so I don't deserve that title. And we hear these thoughts and these conversations a lot. So I'd love to hear from you, kind of, what does the term caregiver mean to you? Like, how do you define it or encourage others to define it?
This is very interesting because for the past 15 years that I have been working with caregivers and being part of the community, it is not foreign to me. I have heard this many times. I myself back in the day in 2009 when Victor, required all the different therapies and everything, that when he was first medically evacuated, I had a friend coming to me and saying, "Do you know you're a caregiver?" And I remember being that caregiver that said, "Oh, no. I am his wife." And I remember that friend convincing me and saying, "Oh, no, Roxana, let's sit down. Let's have a cup of coffee. I'll tell you more about it." Well, her name is Christy Lubin. I will always attribute to her my journey of healing and health and well-being, because I remember she took the time to say, you will go through compassion fatigue. You will
Mhm.
go through this and that. So it was at that moment that I realized, oh my goodness, I am doing all these things for Victor, for my husband. At that time, he couldn't drive, so I was the chauffeur. At that time, I had to, leave him to therapy every morning. I had to do so many different things for him and teach him so many different things. Then I remember, it was one of those moments where you feel you are a wife, but at the same time, it extends to require additional skills. And I think that that's where it's so interesting about the caregiving role, that it looks so different for everyone, yet we have something in common. We love someone, we support someone, and we have been chosen to be that person that provides assistance, either what we call activities of daily living, which could be anything of our day to day activities, or it could be instrumental activities of daily living, who could include finances and driving someone somewhere, the care coordination. So as family or friend caregivers, because not only families are caregivers, but we also have friends that have stepped in into that role. I think that the most important is that we have a definition. There's different definitions, but we have to acknowledge the work that we do and define it based on our way, right, that we are providing that care. But as a rule of thumb, is basically any informal assistance, right, that you are providing that is not related or is not necessarily medical. You're not licensed. You may be a family member, you may be a friend that sees the opportunity and loves someone, and you want to support that person in their recovery or during their healing process. So technically, anyone that steps into that role will be considered an informal caregiver or family caregiver or a friend caregiver.
No, that's perfect because I think, a lot of people I've heard get fixated on especially with like marriage vows, like the sickness and health. And here we are, we're in sickness. And yes, we say that and we never know what's going to happen. But I really liked what you said about like when we step into these roles specifically for that like healing and recovery journey. And right, it's happening in our military and veteran families, but it also happens outside, right? If a family member or
Absolutely.
friend gets some other diagnosis in life that we know happens. That was really helpful. I hadn't heard someone quite put it that way, and I like that a lot. And just reminding people that we get that it's personal, and you need to define it for your own self. A lot of times when I tell people when it comes to some of these different definitions that organizations have, I'm saying, do you feel like you need support, you want support from a caregiver community? Well, then maybe empower you to define yourself as that so that you can get what you need. I think is another important thing, is like taking advantage of the services that are out there.
You know what? And this brings also another topic that within that same, of course, idea is that I have seen in some caregivers that they feel that because they haven't been acknowledged, when you mentioned that different organizations will have different definitions.
Mhm.
No organization will define if you are or not a caregiver. So I have seen caregivers feeling that they're no longer a caregiver because they are not part of a necessarily of a program
Yeah.
or any type of support from an organization. And sometimes what I want caregivers to know is that those are kind of like more formal definitions, so they can receive certain benefits.
Yes.
But the fact that you don't meet the requirements for a program or a service does not mean that you're not a caregiver. When you look at definitions, right, from the AARP or the general community, we have in this country 53 million caregivers,
Um,
and you may be one of them. Not necessarily because you don't meet again, those definitions for specific subgroups or specific programs. That does not take that hat or role of you being a caregiver. So I want caregivers to understand, and family members, that the caregiving role goes beyond the benefits that you receive and the things that you are entitled or that you may be able to receive from specific organizations.
That's really important, and I appreciate that. I think that's really important for people to hear and remember when you maybe do feel that you're up against some of those services. They don't define you. They just are defining their service.
Exactly. Yeah. And I see it more often than not. And it pains my heart because I feel that sometimes that even plays a role in what we're going to be talking about today.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned a little bit as we were talking some of the ways in which you've provided care to your husband, but I think that's so helpful to hear just kind of that spectrum of care too, right? And what some of those tasks are. I wasn't sure if was anything you wanted to expand upon about when you were serving as a caregiver to your husband, what that kind of looked like for y'all.
Hannah, it was very interesting because I remember, this is of course 15 years ago. I was almost a full-time caregiver for my husband for almost 3 years. He required intensive outpatient therapies and he was part of a IOP, or what we call the intensive outpatient programs for neuro rehab. So again, like I said, I would drop him off in the morning, pick him up in the afternoon. He spent there a good 8 hours a day, and he couldn't drive, so he couldn't go there by himself. I have to really maneuver and coordinate between. At that time, I was working full time, and I was also going to school, doing my PhD. So it was very challenging, and it didn't. The reality is that the therapies and the recovery and all the different treatment plan did not end at 5. When he would come home, that's when the rest of the works continued. We had at home, we call it the brain game room. And I remember talking to his, providers and saying, what else can we do at home? So I had to do everything from, the cooking, the transportation, care coordination, and also some of the activities of daily living, assisting him, of course. And then he had to relearn a lot of things. He had to relearn even how to tie his shoes, how to utilize well utensils, and so that really affected a lot of our areas. But in terms of what I had to do for him, were more than the typical day to day that we live as adults, right? So that's when I started noticing, wow, yes, I'm doing more. I need a set of skills that I didn't need before. And that's how our life started 15 years ago, or how it pivoted, right? Or shifted 15 years ago after he was medically evacuated. I should say he sustained a moderate traumatic brain injury. He was discovered to have 3 bleedings in the brain, which require extensive treatment from physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech language pathology, physical medicine and rehab. So at some point in time, I remember I made this slide with all the different providers that were involved in his care, and there were 27 at one time. So that care coordination was pretty challenging, especially when it comes to medication that we see very much happening in our community. And what do we do? So it really poses a challenge in some ways, being a caregiver of someone with a polytrauma, what we're seeing in our veteran community. So that was basically my role 15 years ago. I'm very happy to report that, I am no longer in that same role. I was telling you, offline, how it has evolved. My husband was able to gain a lot of the abilities to be able to do things independently. So with polytrauma and brain injury and some other neurocognitive conditions, the person may not go back 100% who they were, but there's the beauty is that they can relearn how to live with their conditions. In our case, Victor owned it. He is incredibly independent. He does everything by himself these days. I'm there more as a support system to him, but I am not in that intensive caregiving role these days. And of course, that is not a one size fits all, and it's not going to happen to everyone, but that is my personal experience.
I'm curious, I hadn't planned to ask you this, but I'm curious, like for you or for y'all in your relationship, what that transition was like, because I feel like that's when you get used to, okay, now I'm in this role and helping them with these things, and that's what they rely on me for. that for both, I imagine transitioning out of that, which is a new thing too, because it's not like you said going back to what it was before. It's the new normal, you know, that we hear all the time. So I'm curious how that transition was for you as you kind of moved less or more out of that caregiver role and then fully out of it.
I tell you that moving into the transition and out of the transition were very unique. So, moving into the transition, of course, my role as a wife changed.
Mm,
At that time, my husband was in the neuropsych testing. He was like almost a 9-year-old, and he actually behaved like a 9-year-old. So I had to relearn, I had to learn myself to say, okay, Roxana, you have to see this from a different lens and not from the lens of a wife, because the expectations change. My expectations had to change if I wanted to preserve, a relationship and that level of happiness, right? So I had to lower the expectations from a wife to be more as a friend. And this is something we have been very open about, and we talk to couples and others, because I think it's one of the things that brings so much challenges, right, to the couples. Because how do you transition, right, from being that relationship that you had to be something completely different. And it wasn't easy. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It wasn't easy for me. It wasn't easy for Victor. And I remember one day he came home and he said, "Oh, no, 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 no. I'm going to make you fall in love with me again." And he started working really hard in his therapy, because he started telling all his providers that he really needed to go back to being independent and not being what he called a burden. And I never told Victor that word. I never said he was a burden, but I guess he noticed I was exhausted, because caregiving can be exhausting. Absolutely. And, as time went by, Victor started putting a lot of effort into his therapy, which is one thing that I always encourage, caregivers, not to do everything for
right.
their loved one, not to be the 100%. Yes, you can be the support, but not being there so much that you don't allow that person to grow, to evolve, to
Mhm.
gain new skills. Because the reality is that those care recipients, especially when they're veterans, we know that in their culture is just ingrained in them. They're warriors. They can and they will fight for something that they want. And what I try to do is inspire Victor and motivate him to really want to be independent, to wanting to achieve more. And again, I don't want anybody to take this in the wrong way, because that is not achievable in some
Right.
circumstances and some cases. But I'm speaking about our personal experience. And then what Victor did is that, he made it a mission. He made it his mission to own the condition, to move forward, to learn and acquire new skills. And today he's fully independent. When that happened, I remember it felt like our relationship kept transitioning from different, phases. It went from being the spouse that saw her husband going to his third deployment and waving goodbye and kissing goodbye. Then he was medically evacuated, and he did not want to do anything, and all he wanted to do is go back to Iraq, to his soldiers. So that really put a lot of strain into wanting him to engage in therapy. So that was the first task, how can we convince him that this is good for him? And then, to do that, I had to again step aside as a role of the friend, the confidant, right? That support system to him. And then as he's continuing to evolve, and then he got to the point months later, and it was actually some of his soldiers that wrote to him, and they said, "Sir, if you want to be a true leader, just show us that you are taking care of yourself."
Mm.
And that was beautiful to see how he was inspired by them. So, and then moving forward, of course, then he continues to attain, different abilities and skills, and he really did everything possible to also, how you say, like, make me fall in love
Yeah.
with him again. And I know this sounds very like cliche or cheesy, but caregivers will understand what I'm talking
Yeah.
about, because at some point in time, it feels so isolating. And so like, but I'm the wife, and where's everything else, right? So he did everything possible to do that. And then from there we evolve into, okay, now we are basically a couple. We are in a relationship, right? That is a marriage. And then it's readjusting what are the different roles within, the marriage as well. We don't have children, so that brings, I have seen it, where it brings another set of challenges
Of
into
course.
parenting and some other areas, but that wouldn't be our experience because we don't have children. But definitely we have seen the shift and the changes in our role, in our relationship. One thing that I can say is that when we look back, we're like, each phase was a beautiful one. And I'll tell you why. Because there was no part of our relationship that we cannot say that we were not there for each other, even if our role was not the actual being the husband or the wife. We were there for each other. There was respect, and there was camaraderie and friendship. And we look back and we're like, wow, that's incredible how we have
Yes.
grown together to be where we're at.
I really appreciate you being open and vulnerable about the relationship side, because I think that's happening probably in every caregiver relationship, whether it's an intimate partner relationship, a parenting relationship, a friend, a family. Your relationship and the dynamics are changing, and you can resist that. And I wouldn't blame you if you did. Or you can kind of adopt what you said and just be that support. And that led to a really positive experience for y'all, which is amazing to hear. But I can't imagine, having to be able to just say I'm not the wife, and I don't know when I'll get to be the wife again, but I'm here for you.
Absolutely. And it's in those moments that you have to trust that there's a hope at the end of the tunnel, right? And a light at the end of the tunnel. And I don't want to sound like I'm speaking for all caregivers, because I have seen so many different scenarios, and a lot of my friends that we started this caregiving journey for the past 15 years. Many of them may no longer be married, may no longer have that relationship, and is that's totally fine, in terms of nobody should feel guilty about it. And that's why I always say caregiving is not a one size fits all. It is not like, because my experience was this way, everyone needs to experience the same way. It takes two. It takes the team. It takes two to make a team and for the team to work. And I just feel I've been extremely blessed and fortunate to live this life, right, with Victor and the way that we have lived it. But I think it's a testament also of how much, we can now work with other family members and say, hey, there's a glimpse of hope. And if you can both work it together, if you can both be on this together, you may be able to see the light right at the end of the tunnel. And I always joke and I said, it's not a train coming at you, I promise.
May feel that way now, but that's okay.
Yes.
No, that and hope is important in those situations, and but also, like you said, knowing kind of what you can and can't do, setting boundaries. And I feel like that kind of leads to what I know we wanted to talk some more about, which
Mhm.
was, you know, you are having to really shift your roles and responsibilities considerably when you step into this role as a caregiver. And what we had discussed in advance of this was how that changes your identity and where you may kind of lose the pieces of yourself that existed prior to this role. So I'd love to hear you speak a little bit more to that personally, but also I know, work you've done related to this as well. How does this impact your identity as a human being?
And we need to protect our identity. I always tell that to caregivers. This is a topic that is dear to my heart. Why? Because 15 years ago, it happened to me where I sat down. Like I said, I was working full time. At the time, I was a researcher. I was doing my doctoral program. I was doing the PhD. And then my husband is medically evacuated, and that really consumed most of my time and my energy at the beginning. And I remember feeling so exhausted, so depleted in so many different areas, physically, emotionally, mentally. I was depleted one day. And I remember saying, all I think about, even when I'm eating or doing any activities, all I'm thinking about is ahead, is what is coming, the uncertainty, the what ifs, and the crossroad that I was at that time. And I remember sitting down and saying, you know what, Roxana, one thing I don't want to lose is my identity. One thing I don't want to lose is who I am and where I'm going and my goals and my life and my dreams. And I know this sounds very selfish, but it is not selfishness. And I promise you, it's not. It is that desire that I wanted to continue to be me, because it gets to the point of there's a moment where you start feeling that shift. And for me, it was almost like 6 months down the road, 15 years ago. And I started feeling like I was being consumed and absorbed by um, everything that surrounded my husband. And for me, it was a wake up call. I said, I cannot set aside who I am, I have been for 30 something years, and just forget about that person to become someone else. And if I'm about to do that, then I better become someone else that is good and productive and better, because now I need new skills. And I did all this reflection. I'm a very reflective person, and usually over a cup of coffee. And and I was reflecting and reflecting. And I said, okay, what do I need today that I didn't need 6 months ago?
Mm-hmm.
Who do I need to be today that I wasn't 6 months ago? So instead of allowing the caregiving role to absorb who I was and immerse me in that role, I started then shifting, and I started acquiring new skills and then practicing those skills. And at the same time, I started learning about new concepts, like ambiguous loss is an example. You know, how do you grieve that person who they were, but he's still very much here. And by understanding better ambiguous loss, by understanding better compassion fatigue and empathy fatigue and all these different terms, I started equipping myself, and I created a caregiving toolbox in that sense, my imaginary caregiving toolbox. And I started putting all these things together and saying, okay, so while I continue to be me, I need to have these other things in my toolbox. And that's one area that is dear to my heart, because now 15 years later, all the different family members and friends that I have met throughout the years, some are still here and they're very much committed and beautifully working with their loved ones. Some others are gone. Some others are physically gone. They have passed. So we do have a community that very much continues to evolve. And one area that I have seen that has not been talked about, and I think that's why, right, we started talking about this before this podcast, is about how do we preserve our identity, who we are, where we're going, our goals, our dreams. With the caregiving community, especially in the military, you see caregivers are younger. So you more likely are going to be a caregiver for the rest, 3, 4 decades. And what it is about you that you want to continue to be for the next 3 decades, and that you don't want to lose. In my case, was my identity. It was the way that I was and where I was going. So I know that we can talk so much more about this, Hannah, but I want to, pause here and see if you have any. Yeah.
I think I love hearing about the toolkit. And so I'm imagining, as people are listening to us, they're like, yes, my identity feels like it's slipping away, or it slipped away, or how do I get it back, right? It's a cool idea. I agree. But like what are some things that I can do to invest in myself, whether rediscover myself? I think about what you just said about, some of these spouses, family members who may be very young when they step into this role, and thinking about, when we were young, we may not have even really 100% known who we were. So what are some things that you would encourage caregivers who may be struggling with that feeling of loss of identity to do to kind of tap into who they are and protect that for themselves?
Well, I'll tell you that some things that I did and I encourage caregivers to do and family members is that start connecting with others. Yes, you can go online and find all these terms and different things, but there's no other way, better way to learn them from others that have been there, done that. Those who have walked the journey, those who have the professional experience. And this podcast is Veteran Spouse Network. I, for example, have seen a lot of traction, a lot of different activities and services by the Veteran Spouse Network, where you offer classes and training and events for caregivers, even if it's that coffee time, right, among caregivers.
Just connect.
Those are I would say that would be the first step. Remove yourself from that isolation and start connecting with others, start learning from others, start sharing your story. Nobody knows your story better than yourself, and maybe no one has lived your story the same way. So how can we bring beauty and all these different advances out of each of our own stories as a collage, right? And I found myself 15 years ago and even 13 years ago and 10 years ago in groups that they hear my story and then they may have a different journey, but we have a commonality. And that's where you start seeing all these different things, to emerge. So I did not learn about ambiguous loss because I went online and I found it. I was sharing with someone how much I'm grieving my husband, how much I miss him. And that person said, "Have you heard about ambiguous loss?" And then I got the book and then I learned about it. I didn't know too much or anything about being burnout, like caregiver burnout. What does that mean? I was never like in that, position.
Right.
So I started learning more about it and people started sharing more about it. But it's not only just, sharing about how it feels, but it's sharing about what do you do to get out of it or to really overcome. I really love the word overcoming because it just, it's one of those things that caregiving could be. It is a journey. I always call it a journey, the caregiver journey. And the journey has a lot of different twists and turns. And it is like instead of going in a mountain, going straight to the top, it's like circling all around. And you get to see so many different sceneries. And you meet so many different people along the way. And you collect, memories along the way of this journey. And my hope is that as the journey continues, it becomes a healing process for each of our, community members. That it is something that they get to learn more and more how to adapt and overcome each of their situations. And again, why? Because the better we are in preparing ourselves as we walk this journey, the more we're going to be able to preserve who we are and our identity. And the reality is that when you think about identity, it is basically, what makes us unique, what makes me Roxana, what makes you Hannah, right? What is unique about us? And that would require a set of like skills and memories and experiences and all these different things that are unique to us. And my hope is always that in the caregiving community, our identity is not just being the caregiver, but more than that. What have this experience, what did you learn through this journey? How is this journey making you who you are? And in my case, and I would love to share this because this is truly how I feel. I never envisioned being myself a professor in academia. I mean, I wanted to be a health scientist and do research, but I never in my wildest dream thought I was going to end up doing research looking at the health and well-being of caregivers. That is something that was born out of the experience that I went through. And that lived experience and sharing that lived experience with many others in our community form who I am today. And when I look back, I say, And I reflect on this a lot because I'm to myself, I think all the time, how did I get here? Well, I got here because some tragedy happened, but in that tragedy there was triumph. And because of that tragedy, I was forced basically to overcome. And overcoming doesn't feel that I was not facing fear. I faced so many different things, but overcoming means that you equip yourself with all these different qualities that will help you move forward and put one step after the other. And that's what I'm hoping, that the main message, right, for caregivers is that our identity is who we are, who we were, where we're going, but not being completely immersed in the caregiving role that then we forget that we have goals and dreams and a purpose. So that's my main, message.
And that's the perfect like wrap up for that. And I like literally as you're talking, I'm thinking about the same thing, because very similar journey in the sense that I met my husband when I was in social work school, had a whole other different career path planned, population of interest, and then was like, what is going on in my own relationship? I need support. It didn't exist. And here I ended up here, and I can't imagine doing anything else. So I think that's an important thing that you brought up, is when you're exploring, who you are as an individual, your dreams, where you want to go, also being able to look at this experience that's been put in front of you that you may have not envisioned for yourself. How could we? But how has that grown you? And how has that changed for a positive, who you are and what you want to be and do and love and, learn and all of those things. So just really tapping into all aspects of the experience and all aspects of your identity. Yeah, because I imagine neither one of us would be where we are today without the veterans in our lives and the experiences that they had, in service.
I agree. I agree. Who knows where I was going to be? My dream at that time was well, my background is in epidemiology, and I thought to myself, well, I'm going to be studying diseases and all over the world and not taking that, I think that I just love what I do today. I love that I get to contribute to our community just like you're doing as well. And who better, right? Who better than those who have walked the journey? Because I feel that whenever I encounter a caregiver or family member or a friend that is caring for a wounded, ill, and injured veteran, I feel like, oh my goodness, yeah, I may not know your specifics, but I can relate to it. And I think there's something about when you say that you have been on those shoes, that people feel more at ease, and they listen more, and they want to get to know you better, and it just keeps forming this a beautiful community. Because I honestly, Hannah, I feel this is a beautiful community. It
Yes.
is huge, and it pains me that it's so huge, because that means that there's many of us, that have had to go through this journey. But at the same time, what I love is that we're coming together. Without coming together, it would not be a community with just people living in this world having a caregiving experience. But the fact that we're all rallying together, to support each other and to be there for each other, it just means the world to me.
Us too. I mean, it's the work that we do, and I think that's the perfect like end message, is like, don't do this alone, like connect with the community that is there, because man, they are powerful and they are wise. They are going to point you in all the important directions. And I guess to kind of close us out, and you may have already said it in so many of the amazing things you've already said, but is there any, from your wisdom as a caregiver with this lived experience, any one piece of advice you'd like to leave our listeners with, or just a good reminder?
Absolutely. So there's actually science to this, and I want to close out a little bit with the science. So there's actually a term called loss of self, and there's ways to measure that. And in our work in research, loss of self in caregiving has been correlated and is one of the predictors to depression and anxiety and even suicidal thoughts. So let's start avoiding, right, losing who we are. Let's start aiming and make it our goal to preserve who we are and augment that and become somebody that can provide that care, that can support a loved one at the same time that we don't lose who we are. Part of my wisdom, because I get this question all the time from caregivers that know me very well, and they see me on a daily basis, or they see me frequently, and they ask, how do you do it? And how do I walk this journey, and how I do it in a daily basis? I wake up in the morning and I make sure that I have some reflection time. In my case, I'm very faith-based, and I always emphasize that in my life. That's part of my recipe. I love reading scripture and praying, and not because I pray about myself, but I pray that I am a person that can continue to live this journey in a very healthy way, to achieve that well-being that I need to have to be able to help others. And when sometimes you start focusing on others, you start healing yourself. So if we as a caregiver immerse ourselves so much in the caregiving role that we forget that there's a world out there, more likely we're not going to be able to experience that service. Service is everything. So as soon as you're equipped and better to be able to serve others, turn around and help those who are coming behind. I promise you that not only you're going to be helping others, but you're going to be helping yourself.
Yes, yes, you are. Yes, you are. Oh my gosh. Well, thank you so much, Roxana. I really appreciated us having this kind of, I mean, the same conversation that we hear a lot on caregiving, but with this real focus on this, the effects of loss of self, the importance of protecting the identity, because people get so immersed in this role that it just can zoom right by. And I think what you said about prioritizing some of that reflection time is key, right? We hear a lot about self-care, and I made a point of almost like avoiding that term while we talked because we get it, we know, right?
Mm-hmm.
But prioritizing that time for yourself to do what you know is important, whatever that is. For you, it's that reflection time. We encourage all you guys listening to think about what that is for you and make space for it. And if that's all you do and get out of this, that's plenty. So we appreciate everyone who's listening. Know that, if you're someone that going through this experience, you are not alone in it. Join these communities that we're talking about. And just as Roxana said, is once you get to that other side of it, whatever it looks like for you, to be able to plug in back to these communities and support others who are walking behind you is huge, and they will benefit greatly from your wisdom. So Roxana, I appreciate you so much for taking time out to join us and share your experiences as well as your work. We are better for hearing it. So thank you so much. And everyone listening, we hope to see you back next month. Thank you for your time, everybody.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks again for joining us on the Veteran Spouse Network podcast, brought to you in collaboration with Coming Home Well. We thank you for listening today and hope today's session left you feeling a little more connected or gave you some insight into the experiences of our military and veteran families. Don't forget to check us out at veteranspousenetwork.org to learn more about how our military and veteran families can receive the support they deserve.